So in case you're coming in to this video without having watched any of the other videos on the Orlando Health Weekend, let me just give you some brief orientation. This is going to be the first part of a webinar, which was created mostly from content that we presented in the last Orlando Health Seminar or Weekend last year. This part is David Meinz's part. Now, David's an interesting guy. He is the only full-time public speaking nutritionist that I know. He goes on to tell his story that his dad died at age 56 when he was early in college. He'll tell you all of that piece, but he'll also tell you how he got involved with the Bale-Deneen community, similar to me, and also similar to me, actually reversed his arterial age. He'll go into details on that story, but there's a place where I want to immunize you. I know he brings up a contentious point. I know there's a lot of plant-based diet haters out there. There's a whole lot of low-carb, high-fat diet haters out there. It's very interesting. Dave has always been at the plant-based, low-fat end. I've made a transition from there, where I started for 30-something years, over to more of a low-carb. Let me just immunize you again about some of the science behind this. For the low-carb guys, here's part of the problem. As UCLA has studied and shown, and it's in several of our videos, over half of us beyond age 30 way over half, have insulin resistance, and most of that group has full-blown type 2 diabetes. And the vast majority of us, I can tell you from my experience, 90% of my patients come to me thinking they do not have a carbohydrate metabolism problem. They don't have prediabetes, they don't have insulin resistance, they don't have diabetes. Over 90% of my patients. So here's the thing. There's a huge epidemic of insulin resistance, prediabetes out there. Nobody knows about it. But let me tell you David's side of this issue. And it's also very valid. He would say forward broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, asparagus, they're mostly carbohydrate. And technically he's correct. Fiber is classified as carbohydrate. I haven't met a low carb, high fat diet guru yet that says fiber is bad for you and that would nix any of those vegetables I just listed. So that in and of itself, we've got the low carb, high fat folks saying, no, get all the carbs out of your diet, but not recognizing that fiber is a carb. Then on the other hand, you've got the whole population, the vast majority of us having some insulin resistance problems digesting carbohydrates, not only fiber, but all of the sugar-based carbohydrates, and yet we don't know about it. So anyhow, I'm going on too long about that issue. Let me hand it over to David to tell you his story.
Consider this. Every 25 seconds, an American will have a heart attack somewhere in this country. Every minute, someone dies from a heart attack. Every 40 seconds, someone in the United States has a stroke. Remember that strokes and heart attacks are symptoms of the same disease called cardiovascular disease or vascular disease. If it happens in the neck of your arteries or in your brain, it's called a stroke. If it happens in the arteries of your heart, it's called a heart attack. But it's all what we used to call hardening of the arteries, atherosclerosis. Some of you may have been to the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C. You may or may not know that there's 58,000 names on that wall. 58,000 boys and girls gave the ultimate sacrifice during the 10 years or so of our involvement in Vietnam. You know how that tore this country apart. You know the riots in the streets, the burning buildings. It really split America in two. And yet, as much of a tragedy as that war was, as much as that tore this country apart, what I believe to be even more of a tragedy is this. That's the same number, 58,000, of people that die in the United States just from cardiovascular disease every 3 weeks. Every 3 weeks, we have another Vietnam War in the United States. Every 21 days, 58,000 people die again from cardiovascular disease. And then it happens again 3 weeks after that. And then it happens again 3 weeks after that. And it just keeps on happening. And it happens to a lot of people in their 60s and 70s, and somebody writes that off as old age, but it's not old age, especially if you're in your 60s or 50s, and more we're seeing it even in people in their 40s. Your chances of dying from a heart attack or stroke are greater than any other cause. And once you reach age 40, cardiovascular disease will claim 2 out of 3 men and half of the women. And this is an amazing fact to me, but the average years of life lost from a heart attack is 17 years. 17 years of life lost. What could you do with 17 years? You could probably have a nice retirement. You could probably see your grandkids grow up, but not if you have a heart attack and die from it. And ladies, you're not immune from this as well. I know women have been trying to gain equality in many areas of life, but here's one they not only got equality in, they got superiority in. I don't think this is what they had in mind, though. The number of cardiovascular deaths is now greater in women than it is men. And ladies, you've got that status since 1984. If you take all forms of cancer in the United States in women, it's 270,000. That's all forms of cancer. That's breast cancer and everything else. 270,000 women die every year in the United States. But just heart attack and stroke kills 420,000 women. Yes, ladies, you must do breast self-exam. Yes, you must do mammography. Do everything you can to decrease your risk of breast cancer. But many women that sit in the dentist chair these days have their priorities incorrect. They think that breast cancer is their problem. It's heart disease. By the way, most women who die suddenly of cardiovascular disease had no previous symptoms. Their first symptom was that they died. Don't miss that. 64% of women who die suddenly had no symptoms that anything was wrong. Men, it's only 50% for you, but only is not a good thing to celebrate. In other words, at least half the people who die from cardiovascular disease had no symptoms before they died. On this slide, you can see that the blue line represents your risk, ladies, of getting breast cancer as you get older. You see it goes up with time, but not dramatically. The red line is where your potential attention should be, because you see it goes through the roof once you get past the protection of estrogen that you lose at menopause, and it starts going up dramatically. And if we put the men on here, their red line would go up about 8 or 10 years earlier, which is why if you go to a nursing home in whatever state you live in, it's full of women, because the same thing that kills most women in America kills most men, but it gets them earlier, which is why many people think cardiovascular disease is a man's problem. In fact, it's an American problem. It's a Western society problem, and it still kills more women than it does men. One of the reasons it does that is because a woman during a heart attack does not look like she's having a heart attack. When a woman is having a heart attack, she might have things like shortness of breath, pain in her abdomen, sweating. And look at this, in almost half the women, there's no acute chest pain. They don't have that feeling of an elephant sitting on their chest. They don't have that classic pain down the left arm. And what happens is they go into an emergency room, they know something's wrong, but they look like they're having an anxiety attack. And well-meaning health professionals may not say it out loud, but they think, ma'am, would you please wait over here while we take care of more important patients, those men who are having a heart attack, because they look like they're having one. In the meantime, the woman's cardiovascular system is shutting down. She's losing cells in that heart that cannot be replaced again. As a result of that, even though more men have heart attacks, more women don't survive them. And it's not just dentists that this is happening to. You probably know Bob Harper NBC's star on The Biggest Loser television show. You probably also heard that he had a heart attack at the gym when he was 51. And if it hadn't have been for two physicians being there simultaneously, Bob Harper would have become another statistic. He would have died. And Bob eats better than most Americans. And Bob is fitter than anyone watching this program right now. And yet, he had a heart attack and almost died. You probably also remember Tim Russert, the NBC newsman. Now, keep in mind that Tim's doctor had him on a cholesterol medicine, a statin. He was on aspirin to help keep his blood from clotting too quickly. He was on an ACE inhibitor for blood pressure control, and he had got to his target cholesterol numbers. His doctor was happy with where he was. He passed a stress test, was told everything was fine, and he died 8 weeks later at work from a heart attack. How can this happen? And this next one just recently happened, and I can't write this material. It's amazing. This is Dr. John Warner. You probably don't know him, but he's the president of the American Heart Association. And while attending the annual conference of the American Heart Association, surrounded by thousands of other heart specialists, guess what? Yeah, that's right, John Warner, the president of the American Heart Association, had a heart attack. And he was 52 years old. So what's going on here? Clearly we're missing something. Let me bring you up to date today with what we really understand and why so many people can fall through the cracks, and how you can prevent that from happening in your personal life. An amazing fact to consider is that there's 60,000 miles in the human vascular system. I mean, that just is hard to understand, but if you took all the vessels in your vascular system, they would go 2.5 times around the globe. About 80% of them are the capillaries, the very, very smallest part of the vascular system. Now, here's what we used to think, what caused heart attacks and strokes, and this is really important too, so watch this. We used to think when you were young, you had nice, clean arteries, and the blood would flow without any impedance whatsoever, and everybody was happy. And then if you ate too many eggs, the artery clogged up, and all that blood had to flow through that little hole, and eventually it got completely clogged up, and you had a heart attack or stroke. We now know that's not true. Listen carefully. We now understand that most people that have a heart attack or stroke have a clean artery 1 minute before it happens. I'll say that again. Most people that have a heart attack or stroke have a clean artery 1 minute before that happens. How can that be? Only about 15% of the time do the arteries slowly clog up over time. This graphic depiction will give us a good idea what's going on. You see, what you have here is an artery, and the thing called the lumen is the center part where the blood is flowing. So the blood would be flowing out towards you here on a screen. What you see on the outside of that lumen are the various layers of the artery wall. That first layer is called the endothelial layer, and it's only one cell layer thick. Beyond that are some muscle cells and other layers that make up the whole artery. We now understand this. The disease called atherosclerosis, hardening of the arteries, where the plaque is, happens in the artery wall decades before it ever shows up in the lumen, where the blood is flowing. Only when you are very advanced do you get a situation like this. And again, but that's a very small percentage of the time. Most of the time, the artery has disease in the artery wall and the blood is flowing just fine. So what happens? The plaque that's in the artery wall can rupture. It will spill through and break through that single cell layer called the endothelial layer and spill its contents to the lumen where the blood is flowing. The body sees that, tries to fix it with a blood clot, and you get an occlusion where 1 minute before you had a complete clear artery. Let me show you what I mean with this histology slide. You see right here on the left, that's a pretty clean artery. That blood is flowing without much problem. But if you look carefully at about 10 o'clock, there you'll see a white section, and there's some more white section down there about 7:30 and some other places. And then on the right side there is a blow-up of what we see. What that is plaque. It's made up of cholesterol and fat and foam cells, and it's just a mess is what it is. But you'll also notice that there's just a single cell. You see that black layer right there? A single cell layer that's separating that plaque from where the blood is flowing. If that plaque should rupture through that cell, you'll have an event. And it can either kill you or it puts you down pretty quickly. And remember, the artery was open before this happened. Do you see why you can pass a stress test and then die a couple days later if they never knew that plaque was there? And that's the problem today. Most technology today does not show that plaque. It just looks at blood flow. So here's an actual anatomical example of what we're talking about. If you look down there toward the bottom, you see where the endothelial layer used to be, but now it's been broken through. And the body saw that. It made a clot when the plaque started rupturing out. Part of that clot broke off, went downstream to a more narrow area of the artery, and killed this person. And that happens about 85% of the time. So most cardiologists today are what we call luminologists. They're looking at the lumen, the blood flow. If your blood is flowing, you pass. But the physician of the future will be an arteriologist. That's someone who's looking at the arterial wall, the anatomy and physiology of the wall itself, because remember, that's where the disease happens years before. So the first one today, cardiologists today, they look at the lumen. They do it by stress testing, by angiography. The second, the doctor of the future, is going to look at the anatomy of the wall itself, and the technology we have today is called the Carotid IMT. Carotid intima-media thickness is what we're looking at. That's the technology, and that's what we have available at the Healthy Dentist Summit. Some of you listening have already had that test done, and you found out that you have arteries that are older than your chronological age. That's a reflection of inflammation, of the disease starting. Or maybe you even found out that you have plaque. The Carotid IMT can show that. So let's look at the current standard of care. Let's say you're a 50-year-old male, you don't smoke, you have normal cholesterol, you're not overweight, you eat well, you exercise. Your odds statistically of having a heart attack over the next 10 years is about 4%. In other words, if you look at a population of 50-year-old men that do everything right, just like you, and you look at 100 of them, over the next 10 years, only about 4% of them would be expected to have a heart attack. And if that's what your situation is, you'll be told by your physician, keep up the good work. I'll see you in a couple years. But somebody makes up that 4%. How do you know you're not that 4%? You see, you're not a population, you're an individual. Because everyone has heard of stories about Dr. So-and-so who jogged and ran marathons and ate a plant-based diet and was really good at stress management and did everything right. And did you hear about him? No, what happened? Well, he had a heart attack. No, you're kidding. Well, wasn't he? Yeah, he was just 55 years old. And the incorrect response to a scenario like that is when people say this, well, you just never know. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to tell you that's wrong. That's absolutely wrong. We do now know. We can see a heart attack or stroke coming. We can see it years before it comes. You don't have to wait for the first symptom that you have something wrong to be that you die. So you see, when you look at Framingham risk, what that means is that's a standard based on a big population in Framingham, Massachusetts. They looked at several generations of people. They followed their lifestyle and they found out what happened to them. It's really good research. And it's where we get a lot of our recommendations today about not smoking and exercising and eating right. It's good from a population base, but it's not so good for an individual basis of prediction. So what they did was they did a study. They looked at 222 adults. Now keep in mind, these 222 adults already had a heart attack. The men were less than 55 and the women were less than 65, but they had already had a heart attack. And then they applied the standard risk factor protocol to see if they could predict if somebody was going to have a heart attack. And the programs that we currently use today missed 82% of the women and they missed 66% of the men. In other words, they were told, most of the women and most of the men were told, you're fine, when we already know these people had heart attacks. They were told they're fine and yet they had a heart attack. The current risk factor approach tends to identify high-risk people. But probably most of you watching this program today are not high risk. Most of you don't weigh 400 pounds. Most of you are not smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day. And you probably get some exercise, and you probably try to eat right. Well, you're not high risk. I know what to tell people that are high risk. I can tell them. I can't tell them when, but I can tell them what's going to happen to them. But those of us in the middle is where the system falls down. The system misses a lot of us in the middle. But we can do better than that. And that brings us to the carotid intima-media thickness test. And that test is what we do at the Healthy Dentist Summit and that some of you have already had. Now, this is important because the carotid arteries of your neck are a good indication of your coronary arteries. So without actually having to look at your heart arteries, which is invasive and expensive and all kinds of other problems, we can look at the carotid arteries of your neck. They're much bigger, we can see them easier, and the CIMT test is less invasive than looking at your heart. There's no radiation involved. It's easier to measure and is a lot less expensive than going into a hospital and getting your heart looked at. So here's an example. This is what you'd see on an ultrasound. The person's head is to the left of your screen, their feet are to the right of the screen, and you're looking at their carotid arteries, their neck arteries. And a traditional test, ultrasound, sees no problem here. This is what a cardiologist would see normally. They don't see much problem because that blood is flowing and this person would probably be told you're okay. By the way, this is what you get on some of these traveling tests that send the vans around the country where they do a whole body scan and give you all kinds of tests for $200. They're doing this kind of test right here. And they'll probably tell you, in this case, that you're doing just fine. But now let's look and see what the CIMT test will do. Same shot, but watch this. You see that? The CIMT test sees the artery wall. That's arteriology, and that sees the problem. That's plaque, and that plaque potentially could rupture. And that could kill this individual with a stroke if this happens in the neck arteries. And the CIMT not only sees the plaque, it can identify how dangerous it is. If it's what we call soft plaque, it's very likely to break. If it's older, more calcified plaque, it's a little bit more stable. The CIMT can tell that. Other technology really can't. So here's a very well-respected study, and what they looked at here was what would happen if you didn't take any steps once you found you had some disease in your arteries. So let's say you do a CIMT, and we find that your arteries are a little thicker than they should be. They're greater than 1 millimeter. This study found that about 8 people out of 100 over the next 10 years that had thickened arteries, they didn't have any plaque, their arteries were just thicker. About 8 of those people out of 100 would go on to have an event if they didn't do anything about it. But the next one to the right is significant because if you have plaque, as we find in the CIMT, and it's in the wall only, that is, it's not obstructing blood flow, you will pass a stress test 100% of the time in this condition. 40%, 40 out of 100 people that have plaque in the arteries, and if they don't do anything about it, will go on to have an event in the next 10 years. Finally, on the right side there, that's when you have plaque actually obstructing flow. That's what will show up, maybe if it's bad enough, with a stress test. And if that's the case, 80% of those people who have that, and again, who don't do anything about it, will go on to have an event, a heart attack or stroke, in the next 10 years. Most of you are not on the far right. Some of you are there in that thickness category. But a lot of you watching this program today, either you know you have plaque because you've had the CIMT, or we might find it. And in that case, you see you got about a 40% chance of having an event if you don't do something about it. Guess what? The people that don't know they have it will not do anything about it because they don't know they have it. A lot of people get concerned if we find plaque with a CIMT. I'm here to tell you that that bad news is not necessarily bad news because if we find you have it, and I have it, I've had it for a long time, genetically, I've inherited this tendency. If you find you have it, you can now do something about it. Remember, you don't want the first symptom to be the most common first symptom, and that's that you die. I want to give you one more scenario Just to bring this home, on December 8th of 1978, I was away at school studying nutrition as an undergraduate, working on my bachelor's degree. I got a phone call a few minutes after midnight. It was my pastor calling. Now, this was unusual because he had never called me while I was away at school, much less in the middle of the night. He said, "David, you need to come home. It's your dad. He's in the hospital." Well, this is my dad right here. His name was Gilbert Meinz, and he had cardiovascular disease, but we didn't know how bad it was. And he died at age 56 from complications of that cardiovascular disease. And I am my father's son because I've inherited what he inherited from his dad as well. So I want to show you my results of the CIMT and show you what the potential is that you can learn from this. So at age 57, I had my CIMT done, and it measures your age, your arterial age. And arterial age is a measure of inflammation, if you will, of how far along you are in the disease. And I had the arteries of a 69-year-old, even though I was chronologically only 57. That's not good. You can see there on my right carotid artery, they found 2 plaques, but on my left, they found 3 plaques. You see that at the upper top part of the picture right there. So that's not a good situation. So I went on 2 prescription medications. I went on Livalo, which is a statin, and I went on Ramipril, which is a blood pressure medicine. Now, I don't have high blood pressure, but Ramipril and Livalo both are anti-inflammatory. The statins, we thought in the past, lowered your bad LDL cholesterol, and they do. But we now know that's probably not where you're getting your most benefit. The statins seem to decrease inflammation very strongly, as does Ramipril. And what I needed to do was slow down the inflammation in my vascular system. And so I did that with those 2 medications. I also took a fish oil, which I continue to take today at those amounts, 500 and 500 of EPA and DHA, and I continue to have positive health habits, which I had been doing most of my life anyway. So then let's see what happened after 1 year. At age 58, you see now I had the arteries of a 64-year-old. I had actually gained 5 years of arterial age. I got 5 years younger in my artery system, my vascular system, by intervening with those 2 medications that were anti-inflammatory. Oh, by the way, now look, they've only found 2 plaques on the right and 2 plaques on the left. I like what I'm seeing. At age 60, I continued this protocol, and I got younger yet. Now my arteries are 62, even though I'm 60. And you see, what we're finding here is we want your chronological age to match your arterial age. It's even better if your arterial age is even younger than you are chronologically. But if they match, that's a good thing. Oh, and look up there, now just 1 plaque on the right and 2 on the left. I like what I'm seeing here. But then I made a mistake. Then I started to get a little bit cocky. You see, I'm a nutritionist. I've written books, I've traveled the world, people pay money to hear me talk. I thought, I don't want to take medicine. I don't like the idea of medicine. So I stopped my 2 prescriptions and I said, I'm going to do this with lifestyle. So I went on a vegan plant-based diet. I hired a vegan chef. She made 3 or so main entrees for me a week. I would pick them up, bring them back to my house, and I'd get a couple meals out of each entree. I'd supplement those with a salad or something, and that's what I did. I supplemented them with a little salmon as well, because the research shows the best long-lived people around the world, healthiest people, are plant-based with a little bit of seafood, with a little bit of fish. And I did that for 18 months. And intervening with lifestyle now and not medicine, I knew I was going to have some great results. I don't like all these prescriptions. And here's what happened. At age 61, I got worse. On a vegan diet with a little fish, doing everything right, my arteries went from 62 to 66, and now I had 2 plaques on the right and 2 on the left, and now I'm going backwards. And the point of that, ladies and gentlemen, is that for some of us, lifestyle is not enough. I tell my audiences it has to be lifestyle first. You absolutely must do lifestyle first, because for many people, that's enough. You don't have to go on medicine. if you'll just improve your lifestyle. And what that means is taking some body fat off your body, eating more plant foods, less animal-based foods, getting some exercise. You've heard it before. You know what goes into a healthy lifestyle. And for many people, that's all it will take for them to get their CIMT down to where it needs to be. But for some of us, like myself, as much as I don't like taking medicine, I'm very happy to take medicine. So now I'm back on my protocol again, and my numbers are coming down. I learned my lesson. It's an important lesson to learn. So here's the next step. The good news is you can live a long, healthy life with plaque. I have it. Some of you have it as well. We may discover that you have it once you have the CIMT done at the summit. You can live a long, healthy life with plaque as long as it doesn't rupture. And we now know how to do that. We now know how to stabilize it so that it doesn't rupture and spill its contents into the blood system where the body will react to it with a clot. But you first have got to know that it exists. So I want to encourage you again to sign up at the Healthy Dentist Summit. The website is thehealthydentistsummit.com. Go there, read what it says, download the free report, and I hope you'll join us.